Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this, we have a coverage of the situation in Avdiivka, where the Russians have managed to gain full control over the city. The Russians managed to capture about 30 kilometers square, a little more than that, throughout the Avdiivka front. With the capture of the city itself, the citadel area and the coke plant have all been under Russian control as of this moment. The Russians published some geolocated footage which shows them planting their flags around the coke plant area and in the citadel area about there, as you can see in this picture here. So with this geolocated footage, we can confirm that the Russians now have control over the whole city, 100% of it, and the fighting is now moving in a western direction towards Lastashkine. So also reports that they will start operations in the direction of Severna here to the southwest. And with this, we see that the Russians are going to move in a western direction to secure the outskirts of the city and likely create a buffer zone here to the west of Avdiivka through the villages of Berdivki, Zeninivka, Orlivka, Tonenke, and Severna here to the west. I was honestly surprised when the Russians came with this geolocated footage showing that they have full control over the city. This was also confirmed by most sources, and with this we see that the Russians have full control of the city, but it surprised me that the Ukrainians simply withdrew from it. It even more surprised me that they withdrew from every single part of it, including the citadel area and the coke plant, which I didn't expect that they would withdraw from. It was later then reported throughout these reports coming out today that there is a significant amount of Ukrainian soldiers who were left behind within the city. Some sources claim around 1,000, others claim less than that, others claim more than that. What the real number is, I'm not really sure. But with this, the Ukrainian soldiers who were left behind did not put up a fight. They instead surrendered. They gave up their positions. This is why the Russians took control over the whole area, despite it only being one day. The Ukrainians didn't mind, they didn't fight while withdrawing, they didn't do any of that. Instead, they just simply withdrew and gave up the city, and the ones who were left behind surrendered. With the full control of Avdiivka under the Russian hands, we'll see that the front line will instantly move here to the west towards Severna, Tonenke, and so on, here to the western buffer zone. And then the Russians will likely continue along the railways that move through the northern parts, capture Novokalinove and this road intersecting the two highways between the east and the railways to the west, and create this sort of buffer zone to the north as well, and then create a front line that moves along the river lines. So this will likely be the goal of the Russians to gain control over this area. So this will be a two-stage operation. The first stage includes the northern and western parts, and the second stage includes this further to the west. This is all possible due to the fact that the Russians got this city that quickly. The Ukrainians surrendered without much of a fight. At the end of it, this means that the Russians still have enough energy and so on to continue fighting without an operational pause, as we saw previously. Whenever the Russians would capture an area, they would do an operational pause. However, the main reason for that, despite the differences in situations and so on, is that the Russians now have a significant amount of manpower. The reported 600,000 troops on the Russian side allows them to continue this fight even after months of fighting. This means that they simply rotate units out whenever they get tired. As such, the Russians are able to continue their operations without holding these operational pauses, which we saw when the Russian army was 200,000 or less at the front line. The current situation at the front line also allows the Russians to start moving in a northern direction from Avdiivka. Combining that with the operations here to the west of Bakhmut, the Russians could start the operation towards Konstantynivka from both of the directions of Bakhmut and Avdiivka. This is a golden opportunity by the Russians to attack in the direction of the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line and have two positions in opposite directions, being able to flank the city of Konstantinivka from two directions. What I'm saying is pretty much the Russians can launch attacks in a northern direction where they will have to capture a lot of villages and a lot of territory in the way, but if they reach the end of it, they would be at the southern parts of Konstantinivka, and by attacking through Ivanivske, capturing Chasiv and then moving in the direction of the west of Bakhmut, they reach the eastern outskirts of Konstantinivka. In that way, they will bypass this whole section of fortified areas by the Ukrainians and go straight for Konstantinivka. They may also go a safe and slow approach, which would be to fight through this heavily fortified area as well in the direction of Orlivka and attack in the direction of Konstantinivka from three directions. Either way, there is an opportunity by the Russians to attack Konstantinivka from multiple directions, which would significantly improve their chances of taking control over the city. As such, the capture of Avdiivka is strategically important in relation to this. There's also the fact that the city of Pokrovsk here to the west, which is the main supply hub of the Donetsk region, allows the Russians to then push in a western direction towards that city and eventually be able to attack the main supply hub. So there's also an interest in the Russians moving in the western direction. This is why I say that the Russians will likely look to increase their zone of control west of Avdiivka to also include this river line here and the railway that goes to the north, as would likely want to follow the railway all the way to Pokrovsk. Moving on from the Avdiivka front, we have these reports from the Novelsk direction, where the Russians have advanced slightly in the direction of the village. As we see, fighting continues in the direction of Pervomaiska, and there's been steady Russian advances throughout the months of January and now February. And with this, the Russians are also getting closer to Novelsk, which would signify that their operations towards the southern parts of this river line here, going in the western direction of Avdiivka, which would improve their positions to take the river line here to the north and allow the Russians to continue pushing in the westward direction, is progressing with the advance towards Novelsk and Pervomaisk. Moving further south in the direction of the south of Marinka, here in the direction of Pobieda, there has recently, in the past few days, been fights around the village of Pobieda, and in this we have some FAB 500 craters. Some of these FAB 500 craters are no longer empty because, as you see in this picture here, which was also geolocated, a Leopard 2 tank by the Ukrainians drove into one of these FAB 500 craters and was stuck. As such, the crew abandoned the vehicle. It was located here to the south of Pobieda, and with this we see that the Russians are very close to a Leopard tank. If the Russians manage to capture the village of Pobieda, they can get yet another Leopard tank captured. Moving further south in the direction of Novomikhailivka, we see that there are operations here as well. The Russians managed to capture the forest line here and move in the western direction, where fighting was geolocated here to the north of Novomikhailivka. Fighting continues within the town as the Russians continue pressing westwards and the Ukrainians hold their lines and do not retreat from this section of the front line. So it's not like there's a general switch in the Ukrainian battle doctrine where they'll start retreating. They instead was a one-off. Now, to answer the question as to why did Ukrainians withdraw from Avdiivka, why did they surrender the city, why did they pull out of everything, including the coke plant and the citadel area? It is reported by the Ukrainians a lot today, as well as the Russian sources throughout Telegram and other sources, that the Russians have concentrated a significant amount of troops here by the Robotyne section of the Zaporizhzhia front and all throughout the Zaporizhzhia front. And with these reports, we can guess that the Russians will likely launch some sort of operation here in the direction of the Zaporizhzhia front. I did mention this in a previous video. However, today the echoes of those reports have been very loud. There's also been reports so far unconfirmed that the Russians have launched an armored assault in the direction of Robotyne. If these reports are correct, then the Russians are looking to start an offensive operation in the direction of Zaporizhzhia. It is reported that this concentration of Russian soldiers in the Zaporizhzhia front is much larger than that of the Avdiivka front, and it is overshadowing the concentration at the Luhansk front. This means at least 100,000 troops. With these reports, we see that the Russians are concentrating a significant amount of forces, likely to capture Oryhiev, maybe even Polyapole, stepping up operations in a attempt to capture or recapture the Robotyne direction, and also many of these villages to the north of that, capturing them for the first time, to allow them to, in the future, develop further operations in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, the city itself. So with this, we see that there are significant developments here. The Ukrainians do not afford fighting over Avdiivka if there is a threat to the city of Zaporizhzhia. As such, the Ukrainians are redirecting their forces from the Avdiivka direction to the south to hurry up and protect the Zaporizhzhia front before the Russians launch their offensive. This is likely why the Ukrainians completely gave up the city of Avdiivka. They saw that to hold it or to fight in it, they would need to dedicate a significant amount of forces, and if the Russians are just ignoring it and sending additional forces to Zaporizhzhia instead, that would spell a huge issue for the Ukrainians, and they would be falling into a trap by the Russians to reorganize their forces, send them to Avdiivka. It's much more dangerous than simply holding the lines in Zaporizhzhia. So that is pretty much the main reason why the Ukrainians likely surrendered the city of Avdiivka and withdrew from it, despite having to leave some soldiers behind, which was even reported by a Ukrainian commander, the commander of the Ukrainian Tavria group, the Alexander Tarnevsky of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So this commander says that the Ukrainians had to leave some soldiers behind and they told them to surrender instead of putting up a fight so that they could survive. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.